Well, good evening. 7 o'clock on Wednesday, April 14th. It's hard to believe we're in the middle of the month already. Um, Beautiful day. Hope you've enjoyed today. Lori and I stopped at Pappy's on the way home and picked up some barbecue stuff. Oh, so good. So good. So, we've had our dinner from there, and uh, very good stuff. So hope you're all doing well. I want to talk with you a little bit from 1 Corinthians tonight as we're during our Bible reading and devotional time, and um, wanted to just share a little bit from that, like we've been doing this year, and doing our devotional thought from there. According to Greek legend, there was a king of Corinth who defied the gods by his insolent wit. He had evidently ticked him off by some of the things he said, and because of that, he was sentenced to an eternal drudgery of pushing a huge stone up the hill. And when he would get to the top of the hill, the stone would roll back down the hill, and he had to start all over again. Go back down, push it up. So that was his eternal penalty, punishment, sentence that he had to do because he had upset the gods and all that. Some of you may be thinking, it sounds like my job. Just always pushing it up, rolling back down, pushing up, rolling back down. But there was a philosopher who came around several years later, and he found this legend of the Corinthian king kind of a picture of modern man's condition of life, this purposeless and absurdity. That was his view of it. And so I guess that's one view you can really take. But if this philosopher had really read the writings of Paul in his letters to the Corinthians, he would have seen that Paul's approach in dealing with these Christians was a message of purpose and hope for some misdirected people. And certainly they had a lot of things that they were doing that just had some misdirection to it, and they weren't really following the Spirit of God in their life. A little more positive take, I think, of what Paul would take and how they could help themselves than what this philosopher had really brought about. But the spirit of the world was taking over these Corinthians. That's what they were involved in instead of the Spirit of God. And the people of Corinth had a reputation for self-centeredness, and they had a reputation for materialism and immorality. Those were two huge things that the Apostle Paul had to deal with, and so Paul sought to change that. He sought to change their mind and change their mindset. Sometimes we might feel like the church that we attend, has some problems, that maybe there's some sin issues, some things that are going on, or some things we don't like, or some issues that are going on, and really, but when you read this letter to this church, I think some of our problems in the church kind of pale and compared to what Paul was dealing with here. So when you read this, the first 6 chapters have to deal with contentions in the church and the need for unity. Some people were saying, well, I follow Paul and I follow Apollos, and I was baptized by this person, and there was some spiritual pride going on in there. There were some lawsuits that were going on in these. And so Paul deals with that in the first 6 chapters. The next 9, the latter part of chapter 6, and then the next 9 answer questions in regard to marriage and liberty and responsibility and spiritual gifts and church order and giving. You can certainly see how many of those subjects can create some issues in the church. And then in chapter 15, Paul reaffirms and defends the doctrine of the resurrection, which some people were denying. And so we might think that the fact that there even was a church in existence, it could be a testimony to the power of God when you think about all the problems and all the things that they were going through. Now, what we've read about so far in our devotional reading in these first 3 chapters, if you've been doing that, again, is this idea of unity and how important it is. There were divisions in the church. And Paul is very specific about the causes and about the failures. One of the things that strikes me about these first 3 chapters is this thing about the difference between man's wisdom and God's wisdom. Man's wisdom can get pretty messed up. I mean, when you look around at the conditions of our world today, doesn't it come back to man's thinking really being messed up? I think so. Mankind trying to make sense out of the things from his perspective. I'm going to fix this problem. If we're going to fix this problem, it's got to come from, what I think ought to happen, how I think the problem ought to be fixed from a human standpoint, or to get an understanding of things. It's like what we think about it, and very seldom, the problem gets in there when we begin to think about our own human wisdom versus what God can really share with us. I was listening to the news this week and heard an interview of a former congressman, and he's kind of been on the out for a few years. Hadn't really heard much about him. He hadn't been in the news, hadn't said a whole lot or anything. And so the interviewer asked him about a change in position. He had been opposed to a certain legalization of a certain drug at one point in his life, and then now he's for it. And so he stated his reasons, which you could argue whether they were legitimate or not, but he did that. But toward the end of the interview, it was interesting for me that what really came out was that now he was on the board of directors of this company. And so, you kind of see that possibly he's getting paid for changing his position. And but the other thing that was kind of interesting, he was on there to push the sale of his new book. So kind of hard not to see the self-interest there, or to see the change of perspective or opinion about something that you've held, that changes because you're now at an advantage to have that. So anyway, the division in our country right now is really bad. Can it be go back to man's wisdom? I think so. Contrast that, though, with situations, especially in the church, where you have people that are praying, where you have people that are seeking God's leadership and His direction, where people are concentrating on God's mission, where people are trying to resolve conflict that comes up in a positive way, where people are trying to talk through, the issues that they have, where people are genuinely, care about, people and their life and their relationship with God. Where people that in a church that they're seeking understanding, they do everything they can to clear up any kind of miscommunication. All those things work better. It really works out better. And so you see the contrast between the things that happen with man's wisdom and what happens when working with God's wisdom. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, I'm going to read it from the New Living Translation. It's kind of an interesting verse. Paul says, "I know very well how foolish the message of the cross sounds to those who are on the road to destruction. But we who are being saved recognize this message as the very power of God." From a human point of view, the message of the gospel seems very foolish. A suffering and dying Savior? That doesn't really make sense. The greatest among you must be your servant. Doesn't make sense either to the world. Love your enemies and pray for those who are giving you a hard time. Really? Well, from a human perspective, I'd want to destroy my enemy. I want to get back at people that give me a hard time. But power in our life comes from the cross, comes through the cross. And these Corinthians needed a renewal of their mind, their thinking. They were trying to live their lives based on what made sense to them. Self-preservation, self-seeking, self-serving, all that was leading to self-destruction and destroying the church of God. So the message of the cross, though, it cuts to the heart of self-centeredness, doesn't it? The message of the cross is a message of denying self. It's obedience to God, which doesn't lead to self-destruction, but it leads to preservation and good things. And so then in verse 19, he says, as the scriptures say, I will destroy human wisdom and discard their most brilliant ideas, which comes from the book of Isaiah, I believe, where Paul's referring to a time when Israel kind of, by human wisdom, formed an alliance with Egypt to be able to fight against the mighty Assyrians. And Paul is saying, well, it's actually the power of God that's gonna save them. And so he's referring to, I will destroy human wisdom. I will discard their most brilliant ideas. That's how powerful that God is. And it's the same with human wisdom. It's not self-confidence, it's faith that allows us to live like God wants us to live. And in the following verses of this chapter, it's not on man's terms and initiative, but it's on God that as people we find what we really need. It's that we find the understanding, we find the answer to some of the things that we're looking for. Sometimes I wonder if Paul didn't have a smile on his face, or even a little bit of a chuckle when he wrote these words urging the Corinthians to survey their situation, that from a merely human perspective, wisdom, influence, high intelligence was really in short supply. Just look around and where do you find it? It's kind of like some of us sometimes, like, what in the world? What are they thinking? Who in their right mind, would think that? And that indeed is the problem, that we're not as smart as we think that we are. So God turned the world's standards upside down and usually chooses the ordinary rather than the brilliant to show who's really in charge and who really knows best of how things in life. There are so many times when I attempt to think through stuff with human wisdom, whether it's making personal decisions, whether it's advising others. Sometimes I think I can get caught up in thinking about, well, what am I going to say to them? Or how am I going to help them? Or, thinking about what I'm going to say rather than, God, how we speak through me, how are we going to help? How are we going to deal with this? How can we best help people to really find you and know you and get them back to you? Sometimes I use human wisdom in dealing with some of the problems that I might have or that I'm dealt with. Even tonight on my way home, I was on the phone with somebody, and we're talking about stuff. And again, how do I handle that? Is it, well, Mark? What are you going to do? What are you going to say? How are you going to solve this problem? Or is it, God, speak through me, to really be able to help this individual and to be able to get things in a better place of what you would want. So, I know God. I know God has given us a brain. I know God has given us some common sense, and we need to put that into action. But I'm also reminded of how much I need to rely on God, how much I need the wisdom of God, how much I need to be in prayer about that. James, what James said in chapter 1, verse 3, he says, actually it's in verse 5. He says, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God. And he adds this, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it'll be given to him. So again, we're instructed that we're to ask God, seek that, because there's some really hard things that happen and come up in our life, and I don't know what to do, or I don't know what to say. In the last 3 weeks, there's been 2 families that have lost children that I know very carefully. One of them, it was 3 weeks ago, was a 47-year-old daughter, and an accident took her life. She left four beautiful daughters. Tomorrow night, I'm going to be speaking to a whole bunch of people in a family in regard to the fact that they lost a 17-year-old boy just so quickly. That morning, he's fine. He develops a fever. They think it's COVID. Doesn't have COVID. He ends up with a a horrible three diseases that came together and took his life, and so they're dealing with that, and it's hard from a human wisdom perspective. What do you do sometimes in life? There are those in the church in our church who have health related problems. Some that are older and some that are younger right now, that are going through some struggles. And so, what do you do about that? What do you say about that? Others have family members that are touched by health issues. There's craziness in our families. There's financial concerns. There's fractured relationships. And there are some tough things going on. And from a human wisdom perspective, it can get pretty confusing and pretty frustrating. And a lot of us at times, we don't know what to do. And there are those times when I'm thinking selfishly. And if I'm not careful, I can be like these Corinthians and be thinking about myself too much. Which is kind of it's a convicting thing. And Paul gets at that in chapter 3 when he shares some pretty convicting words. Dear brothers and sisters, when I was with you, I couldn't talk to you as I would to mature Christians. I had to talk as though you belonged to this world and as though you were infants in the Christian life. I had to feed you with milk and not with solid food because you couldn't handle anything stronger. And you still aren't ready. For you are still controlled by your own sinful desires. You're jealous of one another. You quarrel with each other. Doesn't that prove that you are controlled by your own desires? You're acting like people who do not belong to the Lord. Yeah. Why? Because we're trying to operate from a human perspective. We're trying to think that way. And so we need to grow up. I need to be growing. I need to be feasting on solid food. I need to get my head out of this world and seeking God for his wisdom. How thankful I am for the message of the cross. Aren't you? I'm so thankful for that. How thankful I am for the wisdom of God. How thankful I am that I have somebody that I can go to and say, God, how do we figure this out? What's going on? And even if I don't understand, I know that he's still in control of things. And as Paul said, to those who are perishing, living like this is the only life we have, that message is foolishness. It doesn't make any sense. But to those of us who love God and are saved by accepting his redemptive work on the cross, it is the power of God. The power to keep us unified, the power to give us clarity in making decisions, the power to open our eyes to what we need to know and how we deal with situations, and the trust we have when things just don't make sense. And the power that it gives us to live counter to the culture that we're in. So tonight, if you feel like you're pushing a rock up a hill only to have it rolling back down, and you're pushing it back up and rolling back down, realize that there's a purpose and a mission that God gives you. Keep praying for God's wisdom to help you fulfill that mission. Be thankful for the redemptive work on the cross, and also be thankful for a church that is unified and loving. Boy, I am. I am so proud of our church. I'm so thrilled with our church. I'm grateful for the unity that's there. I'm grateful for the love that's there. I'm grateful for people that pray, for people who seek God's mind about things, who have a mind of God, that wants to do that. I'm so grateful for that. People who serve. And again, sometimes we get together and we try to put our heads together as to what to do or how to do it. But I'm really grateful that we have a church that is not like this church in Corinth, and that we're striving and seeking to do God's will and to be faithful to him. So I'm grateful for that. Before I left today, some of you know this, I've shown it to you at church, but my Grandpa Snow, my mom's mother, my grandpa years and years ago, I think it was in 1932, if I remember the date on the back, but he made a wooden cross, and it's hanging in my office. And if you haven't seen it, I invite you to come in and see it. But he made a cross, and he put the words into the cross, down and across. The way of the cross leads home. And again, as I looked at that, it was a reminder. It was a reminder that it certainly does. That it's the cross that leads us to where we need to be, and not looking at things from a human perspective, but to look at it from God's perspective, and it changes everything in our life. So that's a word that's encouraged me today. Hope it's encouraged you, and again, be grateful for your church. Be grateful for your church family. Be grateful for what we have and what we share, and keep being the church, okay? And we're going to be good, and we're going to do some great things for the kingdom. I love you all. Sermon number 2 on heaven is coming up, and so I finished up the notes on that today, and we're going to talk about a description of heaven. So we're going to look at 2 Corinthians 5. We're going to look at Revelation 21. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians 15. So if you want to read those chapters before Sunday, you can do that. And we're gonna get a little description of heaven and what it's kind of like, and it's just mind-boggling. Okay, how wonderful and great it's going to be. So that's this week. Hope to see you. If not in person, online, and stay safe, hang in there, and keep pursuing the wisdom of God, okay? Love you all, and we will see you soon. Bye.